The night Cormac Shaw left, he didn't slam anything. That was the part Waverly Cross would remember longest, the terrible quietness of it. He came home from work at 6:15, the same time he always did, set his keys on the entryway table, and asked her to sit down at the kitchen island. He had the careful, composed face of a man who had rehearsed this in the car. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "and I don't think I can do this anymore." Waverly had been home all day. She'd spent most of it on the couch because her hands had been swollen since Tuesday, and her rheumatologist had increased her methotrexate dosage only 2 weeks before. There was a half-finished mug of chamomile tea on the coffee table, and a weighted blanket she'd pulled over herself sometime around noon and never taken off. "Do what?" she asked, though some part of her already knew. "This." He made a gesture that encompassed the room, the blanket, her hands resting in her lap. "I didn't sign up for this version of things." She was 36 years old. They had been married for 8 years. She had been diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 4 months ago. "I'm in treatment," she said. "The rheumatologist says by spring." "I know what she says." His voice was even almost kind, which made it worse. "But I've been watching you for 4 months, Waverly. And I keep thinking, this is going to be my life now. Managing around your bad days. Rearranging everything. And I'm honest enough with myself to know I'm not built for that." She didn't cry. Her hands were aching and she was tired in a way that went past physical. And she had learned a long time ago not to waste tears on things that had already been decided. "Where will you go?" she asked. He looked at the counter. "Jade and I have been talking." Jade Mercer, 29. Events coordinator at his company. Waverly had met her twice at office parties and had thought, both times, that she was the kind of woman who laughed too loudly at other people's jokes. "You've been talking," Waverly repeated. "It just happened. I want you to know that's not the reason." "It's fine," she said. "Get your things." He looked almost disappointed that she hadn't fought him. He had probably expected her to cry, maybe to beg, to give him the scene that would let him leave feeling righteous. She didn't give it to him. She sat at the island with her swollen hands folded in her lap and waited, very quietly, for him to go. He was packed and out the door before 9. She heard his car pull out of the driveway. She went to the window and watched the taillights disappear down the street. And then she went back to the couch and pulled the weighted blanket over herself again. And sat in the silence of they had shared for 6 years. Their condo was in Kitsilano, half a block from the beach. They had bought it together in a different world, when they were 30 and 32, and Vancouver still felt like a place you could afford to stay. She called her cousin Bex, Rebecca Thorne, who lived in a third-floor walk-up on Commercial Drive and worked as a pastry chef and had always had more opinions about Cormac than she'd been allowed to express, and told her what had happened in a voice that was steadier than she expected. "Come stay with me," Bex said immediately. "I'm okay." "You're not okay, come stay with me anyway." She didn't. She stayed in the condo and focused on her treatment and on the manuscript she had been working on for 5 years. Quietly, methodically, in the hours before dawn, when Cormac thought she was just getting up early because she couldn't sleep. The manuscript was called The Ledger. It was 340 pages long. It was about a financial fraud she had uncovered at Meridian Capital Partners, the investment firm where she'd worked as a forensic accountant for 6 years before going independent. She had discovered it almost by accident. A discrepancy in a third-party audit that didn't match the fund reports. And then another. And then a pattern she couldn't explain any other way. The fraud had been running for 11 years. The people inside it were careful and patient, and had no reason to think a quiet woman in a corner office had noticed anything at all. She had spent the first year verifying everything, the second year documenting it. She'd taken her findings to a securities lawyer she trusted, a woman named Vera Quinlan, who had worked financial crime cases for 30 years and whose first response after reading 40 pages was to close the folder and say, "Waverly, you cannot tell anyone you've shown me this yet." She hadn't. She'd kept working on it. She had mentioned the project to Cormac once, early on, described it as a book she was writing, a financial memoir of sorts. He'd nodded in the distracted way he had and said, "Who's going to read a book about spreadsheets?" and gone back to whatever he'd been watching on TV. She had not brought it up again. Now, with Cormac gone and the condo very quiet and her hands aching less as the weeks passed and her medication leveled out, she wrote. She wrote in the mornings and she wrote in the evenings and she wrote on bad days when her fingers moved slowly and she had to rest every 20 minutes. She finished the manuscript in February, 3 months after Cormac left. In March, Vera connected her with a literary agent in Toronto, a woman named Sylvie Park, who had a reputation for taking on nonfiction that frightened other agents. Sylvie read the manuscript in 4 days. She called Waverly on a Thursday morning, while Waverly was sitting at her kitchen table eating toast. This is going to change things, Sylvie said. Not just for you. I mean, you understand what's in here, right? This isn't a book, it's a detonation. I know what's in it, Waverly said. I have 3 publishers in mind. We're going to auction this. The auction took 2 weeks. The winning offer came from a Toronto house called Ridgemark Press. $1.4 million for North American rights. Waverly read the number in the email, then read it again, then put her phone face down on the table and sat very still for a long time. She called Bex. I need you to say a number back to me, she said, to confirm I'm reading it correctly. She read the number. Bex made a sound that wasn't quite a word. 1.4 million, Bex finally said. Waverly, $1.4 million. That's what I thought it said. Are you crying? No, Waverly said, and then she was, a little, in the way she hadn't been able to the night Cormac left, sitting alone on the couch with her weighted blanket, watching his taillights vanish around the corner. The ledger was published 8 months later. It did not arrive quietly. The book named names. It traced money through 17 shell companies, 4 offshore accounts, and a network of falsified audit reports going back to 2013. The securities fraud detailed inside triggered an immediate investigation by the Ontario Securities Commission. Within 6 weeks of publication, 3 senior partners at Meridian Capital Partners had been charged. A class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of more than 200 investors. The book debuted at number 2 on the national bestseller list. The following week, it reached number 1. Ridgemark sold documentary rights to a production company out of Montreal. CBC ordered a 4-part series. 6 weeks after publication, Waverly sat in a studio in Toronto under careful studio lighting and spoke with a journalist on the National for 45 minutes. She wore a dark green blazer and her hair was pulled back simply, and she spoke in the same quiet, measured voice she had always had. The voice Cormac used to call, not unkindly, corporate robot mode. She talked about the numbers she had found, about the years of silence, about the morning she had finally handed the full documentation to Vera Quinlan and said, I think it's time. About the rheumatoid arthritis diagnosis and the months of treatment and what it meant to finish the manuscript on days when her hands could barely hold a mug. Were you afraid? The journalist asked. Waverly considered the question. I was afraid for a long time, she said, and then I was just tired of being afraid, so I finished the book. Across the country, in a bar on Granville Street in Vancouver, Cormac Shaw was having a drink with a colleague when the television above the bar switched to the National. He didn't notice at first. He was deep in a conversation about Q2 projections, and Jade hadn't been returning his calls consistently for the past 3 weeks, and there was a low-grade anxiety he'd been carrying for months that he hadn't quite been able to name. Then someone at the bar said, Oh hey, that woman's been everywhere. You see that book? Cormac looked up. The camera was close on Waverly's face. She looked nothing like the woman he'd left on the couch with her weighted blanket and her mug of chamomile tea. She looked composed, but that wasn't quite the right word. She looked like someone who had been composed for a very long time and was only now allowing other people to see it. The chyron below her read, Waverly Cross author The Ledger, national bestseller week 6. His drink sat untouched for the rest of the broadcast. He drove home that night in silence. He sat in the parking garage of the apartment building he'd been renting since the split, a 2-bedroom in South Granville that cost $400 more per month than his share of the Kitsilano mortgage, and stayed in the car long after he'd turned off the engine. He told himself he'd always known she was smart. That wasn't what surprised him. What surprised him, what settled in his chest like a stone, was that he had lived with her for 8 years, slept beside her, shared every meal, and had never once suspected that the quiet woman with the early mornings and the long silences, and the manuscript he'd dismissed in 30 seconds, was sitting on something like that. The weeks after that were not kind to Cormac Shaw. Jade Mercer ended things in May over brunch at a cafe on West 4th, in the tone of someone canceling a standing reservation. She had met someone else in the industry, a VP at a tech firm in Seattle, someone with stock options and a future that moved in a direction she wanted to move in. I think we both knew this was casual, she said. I left my marriage, Cormac said. Jade looked at him with a patience that was barely still patience. I know, she said. That was your decision. She paid for her half of the brunch. She was gone before he finished his coffee. 2 months after that, the company where Cormac had worked for 6 years, where he had been national sales director, where he'd had his best year on record 18 months ago, was named as a peripheral beneficiary in the Meridian Capital fallout. Not charged directly, but named. The CEO spent 2 weeks in meetings with lawyers. 3 departments were restructured. National sales was among them. Cormac received his severance via email on a Wednesday morning. which he considered the most undignified possible delivery for 11 years of a career, but which he had no one left to complain to about. He applied for other positions. The market was difficult. He was 41, and the connection to the Meridian fallout, even peripheral, even cleared, was the kind of thing that showed up in background searches and made hiring managers go quiet. He moved out of the South Granville apartment when the lease expired. He moved to Surrey, into his parents' spare room, which smelled like fabric softener and old carpet, and where his mother greeted him at the door with the expression of a woman who had seen this coming for years, but had the grace not to say so. He thought about Waverly every day. Not the way he'd thought about her when they were married, as a fact of his life, as furniture, as someone he'd chosen, and quietly stopped choosing somewhere along the way. Now he thought about specific things. The way she hummed absently while making tea. The way she corrected arithmetic in her head, faster than he could reach for his phone, without ever making him feel stupid about it. The way she had sat at the kitchen island the night he told her he was leaving. Hands folded, face entirely still, and said, "Get your things," with a composure that had, at the time, made him think she didn't love him enough to fight. He understood now that he had that exactly backwards. He drafted a message to her 17 times. He deleted 16 of them. The 17th he sent to an email address that may or may not have still been active, and which produced no reply. He tried her old number, disconnected. He reached out to 2 mutual acquaintances. One didn't respond, the other replied with 3 words, "She's doing well." In November, almost a year after the book came out, Cormac found her new address through a property records search. Waverly had bought a house in the Annex in Toronto, not far from the University of Toronto campus, a neighborhood of old trees and Victorian brick and narrow streets that felt nothing at all like Vancouver. He knew in some reasonable part of himself that arriving unannounced was not the right thing to do. He bought a plane ticket anyway. He stood outside the house on a Tuesday morning in mid-November, when the maples had dropped everything and the street was covered in frost-stiffened leaves. It was a rare Victorian semi-detached, gray-painted brick with a bay window and a wreath on the door. There was a light on in the upstairs window. He rang the bell. A young woman answered, early 20s, carrying a tablet, clearly in the middle of something. She looked at him with the efficiency someone paid to manage other people's time. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Waverly Cross, we know each other, He stopped. "I'm her ex-husband." The young woman's expression did not change. "One moment," she said, and left him on the step. He waited 3 minutes. He had time to notice that the front garden, small as it was, had been planted with intention, the sort of careful design that would fill with color in spring. Then Waverly appeared in the doorway. She was dressed simply, dark trousers and a cream-colored sweater, hair loose around her shoulders. She looked well, she looked settled in the particular way of someone who had arrived somewhere and knew it. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not surprise, not warmth. Something more measured than either. "Cormac," she said. "I know I shouldn't have come," he said immediately. "I know that. But I've been trying to reach you and I couldn't and I needed to see you, I needed to tell you." The speech he'd rehearsed on the flight from Vancouver had come apart at the first syllable of her name. "I made a mistake. The biggest mistake of my life. I left you when you needed someone there, and I have been living with that every single day. I am sorry, Waverly, genuinely, completely sorry." She said nothing. "I thought," he pressed on because the silence was unbearable, "if I could just talk to you. If you could just hear me out. We could. I'm not asking for everything back. I'm just asking for a chance to show you I'm not who I was when I left." He was aware distantly of tears on his face. He had not planned that. Waverly looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped outside, pulling the door almost closed behind her, and leaned against the doorframe with her arms loosely crossed. Not defensively, just still. "You want to talk," she said, "so talk." He had not expected that. He'd expected a door in the face or a conversation through a lawyer, or the exact kind of coldness that would have been easier to walk away from than this. Her standing there, looking at him calmly, willing to listen. "I was afraid," he said. "When you got the diagnosis, and I know that's not an excuse. I know you were the one who was sick, and I was the one who got to choose, and I made the wrong choice. I was terrified of what it meant, of what it was going to take, and instead of being honest with you about that, I made a decision and called it clarity. I called it knowing myself." "You were honest," Waverly said. "That part was true. You told me exactly what you were and what you weren't willing to do. I've never once doubted that you meant it. But I want to be different now." "I know you do." Her voice was not unkind. That was the thing he would remember later. She didn't say any of it unkindly. "I believe you're sorry. I believe what's happened to you in the last 2 years has taught you things you didn't know before. I hope it has. I genuinely hope you come out of it a better person than you were then. But that's not enough. She said it simply, without cruelty. You didn't leave me because things were hard. You left because you decided, in a moment when it cost something to stay, that I wasn't worth the cost. You looked at me sick and struggling and scared, and you did the arithmetic, Cormac. You were very good at arithmetic. And you decided I didn't add up to enough. He opened his mouth, she continued. The book, the money, whatever came after, none of that is the point. I know part of you is telling yourself this is about the life I have now. But if I were still in that Kitsilano condo treating my arthritis and working freelance accounts, this conversation would go exactly the same way. Because what you did had nothing to do with what I was worth on paper. It had to do with what you believed I was worth when it was just us, and it was hard and nobody was watching. Cormac said nothing. Something in his chest that had been compressed for a long time released into something worse than pain. I don't hate you, Waverly said. I want to be clear about that. I spent a long time being sad and then a long time being angry, and then I wrote 412 pages, which is apparently what I do with feelings I don't know what else to do with. Somewhere in those 412 pages, the anger went somewhere quieter. She paused. You can call it forgiveness if you want. I don't know that I have a better word, but forgiveness and reconciliation are two completely different things. I can forgive you and never see you again, and that's what I'm choosing. Waverly. I'm the same person I was when you left, she said. You didn't fall out of love with some lesser version of me and come back wanting an improved one. I'm the same. You changed what you were willing to see. She looked at him one last time, a full, unhurried look, the kind that doesn't miss anything. I hope things get better for you, I mean that. Then she turned and went back inside, and the door closed behind her without a sound. Her assistant appeared at the side gate and walked Cormac back to the street, in the way someone guides a guest to the exit when the evening is over. He stood on the pavement under the bare maples, in front of the house she had bought herself, in the city she had moved to without him. And he understood something he'd been circling for 2 years without ever quite landing on. He had always believed he was the interesting one. The one with momentum, with a career going somewhere, with a calendar that filled itself. He had believed without ever examining the belief that Waverly was the steady background of his life. Dependable, capable, necessary the way walls are necessary, but not the thing you pointed to when someone asked what made the house remarkable. He had been wrong about everything. The woman he had left on a couch with swollen hands and a weighted blanket and a half-finished cup of tea had spent those same years quietly documenting what would become the most consequential financial whistleblowing case in Canadian securities history. She had done it methodically, patiently, alone. She had done it while sick and while abandoned and while managing every dollar in a way he had never had to. She had finished the manuscript because she was the kind of person who finished things, which was also something he had never fully understood about her until now. Standing on the cold pavement with the door closed and the light still on in the upstairs window. He stood there for a long time. The wind came up the street and lifted the last of the frozen leaves from the gutter, and eventually he turned and walked toward the main road to find a cab, because there was nothing left to do but go. What he had lost, he understood now, was not a windfall he'd missed out on, not a winning lottery ticket discarded before anyone checked the numbers. It was not the book deal or the house in the annex or the CBC documentary or any of the visible, countable evidence of a life rebuilt. What he had lost was a woman who would have been there, quietly, steadily, without condition, through everything that came next. He had held that in his hands and looked at it and decided it wasn't enough. He had set it down and walked out the door and driven across the city to a woman who wanted the version of him that didn't cost anything. The version that cost nothing, he now knew, was worth exactly that. He had made his choice, she had made hers. And she had stopped looking back long before he ever showed up on her street.